All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. Thank you for joining us today for the third webinar in our six-part series exploring the National Park Service's criteria for establishing World War II heritage cities. Starting last week and continuing through this week and next, we will learn about the criteria for purposes of application and evaluation by Park Service staff from the authors of our essay series on the topic. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Jon Taylor on criteria 7, personnel serving in the armed forces, their achievements and facilities for their rest and recreation. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. This webinar is being recorded, both for those who could not attend live today or those who just wish to be able to review the materials being discussed. We will send, probably towards the end of next week, we will send recordings of all 6 webinars to everyone who registered for the program via an email follow-up. So keep your eyes out for that. Closed captions have been enabled for this webinar. If you do not see them automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted unless you're asking a question during our Q&A period at the end of the webinar. And at any time, you can pop questions for Dr. Taylor, for our Park Service colleagues, for NCPH, into the chat area in your Zoom window, and I will help facilitate a Q&A at the end. I also want to pass on the warm welcome and kind wishes from Supervisory Historian Dr. Turkaya Lowe at the National Park Service. Dr. Lowe is the reason that NCPH is involved in this project and several others related to the World War II Homefront, and we are so excited to be partnering with the Park Service in this regard. The World War II Heritage City program was a result of the John Dingell Act in 2019, and every state and territory in the U.S. is able to designate one heritage city designated by the Secretary of the Interior, one World War II heritage city. And thank you. There are some links in the chat, both for the World War II Heritage Cities program itself, a link to the full set of 10 criteria essays prepared as part of our project with the Park Service, as well as a link to the list of designated American World War II heritage cities to date. The application period for this year has closed and another will likely open next year, and we'll send more information about that as well. So I wanted to express Dr. Lowe's welcome and regrets for not being able to join with us today. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Jon Taylor served as historian and park ranger at the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site from 1993 to 1998. He left the park to pursue a PhD in history at the University of Missouri-Columbia and graduated in 2004, and then joined the history department at the University of Central Missouri in Warrensburg, located about 45 minutes to the east of Kansas City, where he has taught for the last 19 years. Taylor is the author of 4 books on the life, political career, and legacy of Harry Truman, including A President, a Church, and Trails West, Competing Histories and Independence, and Freedom to Serve, Truman, Civil Rights, and EO 9981. He is currently working on a book about Harry Truman's Senate career. So welcome, Dr. Taylor. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for that warm welcome, and welcome to everybody who's joining us on this webinar today. Historian David Kennedy noted that almost 16 million men, most of them conscripted, and 500,000 women, all volunteers, served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, 1 in 10 Americans served in the military. Now, what is remarkable is that in 1940, there were a little over 458,000 men in the Army, Navy, and Marines. And by 1945, that number had exploded to 12.2 million, including members of the Coast Guard. Within a very short time, the United States had not only drafted and recruited a military that waged war around the world, even when the military was segregated by race and gender and could exclude individuals based on their sexual orientation, but had equipped the military to be effective on the battlefield. The key to understanding why the United States was successful in raising a force can be found in the steps that the country had taken prior to December 7th, 1941. In June of 1940, we see a peacetime expansion of the military, and Congress passed two critical bills that increased defense spending and increased troops. On June 13th, Congress approved a bill that appropriated over $1.7 billion and allowed the military to expand from 227,000 troops to 280,000. On June 26th, you see the passage of the first Supplemental National Defense Appropriation Act. This increased the size of the military to 375,000 and funded construction for reception centers, troop housing, airfields, and seacoast defenses to support this enlarged military. In September of 1940, you see the United States institute the first peacetime draft. And Congress approved the first peacetime draft, which required men between 21 and 45 to register by October 16th, 1940. The law also included unequivocal language that prohibited, quote, discrimination against any person on account of race or color, end quote, but it was not enforced. Neither the Navy nor the Marine Corps initially relied upon the draft so that they could get around complying with the non-discrimination clause. Consequently, most of the early draftees went into the Army. This legislation also created a system of draft boards across the country that would oversee a lottery system to determine who would be drafted next. The other ways in which Franklin Roosevelt could raise more individuals to serve in the military is that he federalized several divisions of the National Guard. He used Executive Order 8530 to do just that. And that brought an additional 63,000 officers and men into the military. And mainly they went into the Army. Now, what was unique about this was that this executive order that federalized the divisions of the National Guard had to be voted on every year. And the next year, in September of 1941, in Congress battled over whether or not to extend these one-year appointments for the National Guard troops that had been federalized. And in fact, in September of 1941 in the House, the vote to extend the federalization only passed by one vote. Kind of demonstrates that the country was still very concerned about entry into the Second World War and where that was headed. Now, the War Department continued to focus on building training camps and airfields to support the increased numbers of troops that were coming into the military. And by 1941, the War Department had constructed at least 242 training camps, mostly in the South. And they were also concerned about the troop morale on these camps that were being constructed. Secretary of War Stimson created the morale branch of the War Department on March 8th, 1941. And it was later renamed the Special Services Branch. It had 6 operating divisions. We'll take a look at 4 of them. But by the end of 1941, the morale branch had 70 officers and over 150 civilian employees. Here are some of these branches. The Army Exchange Service managed the post exchanges, and they operated under a commanding officer, and they allowed service members to buy personal items. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see the Army Exchange Services at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. You notice the one sergeant playing the pinball machine, which happened to be in that exchange service office. On the right-hand side, you can see the folks there, service members at Lake Merritt, California, enjoying a Coke and a snack. Another important division was the Army Motion Picture Service, and it operated picture theaters on bases for service members. They would try to show at least one show a week. It would cost about 14 cents. They would show new movies when they came out, so they weren't like delayed. So they were first showing movies that had debuted in civilian theaters. The Services Division oversaw a number of recreational facilities that were constructed on bases or camps. And in each camp, they tried to provide a day room for the company where service members could read, write letters, or play games. The Service Division also oversaw construction of regimental recreational halls, base chapels, and service clubs, which usually had a great hall, which was used for dancing, a cafeteria, and a reception room. And a lot of these facilities also contained a library. And here you can see Chaplain Willard James surveying the books in his base library. Another important division was the Welfare and Recreation Division. And this division oversaw the recreational planning conducted by the various auxiliary organizations which supported the military bases and camps, like the USO and other auxiliary agencies included the YMCA, YWCA, Jewish Welfare Board, Travelers Aid, and the Salvation Army. In December of 1941, the USO financed Camp Shows Incorporated, which provided troops with a professional show about twice each month in the camps throughout the United States. 12 shows operated continuously on a major circuit and 14 on a minor circuit of the smaller camps. Also, the Red Cross provided recreation and welfare activities for soldiers. So after the United States entered into the Second World War, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, there was increased focus on trying to draft individuals into the military. And so in December of 1941, the Army had some 36 divisions that were combat ready, which amounted to about 1.6 million men. And this was practically the equivalent of the American military strength in November of 1918 at the conclusion of World War I. After December 7th, as I noted, the demand skyrocketed, and the draft, which had been put in place in 1940, continued. The camps that were constructed for military training really exploded from 1941 to 1945. Particularly among the ranks of the Army. The Army was essentially divided into the Army Ground Forces, the Army Air Forces. You do not have a separate branch of the Air Force until 1947, so after the Second World War. So the Army Air Forces were a part of the Army, and then the Army Service Forces. The Army Service Forces would have been engineers, quartermasters, those kinds of support services positions. After 1944, or from 1941 to 1943, the Army Ground Forces trained whole divisions at one time. After 1944, the Army focused on training replacements to enter its 90 divisions. Training a division took almost a year, and selectees usually started with basic training where they learned the drill, military courtesy, and physical conditioning. The second phase of the training focused on learning their specialty and working together. Now, after the United States entry into war, the focus was really expanded to include individuals regardless of gender. And so after 1941, you see larger numbers of women coming in to fill these kind of military roles. In May of 1942, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was created. President Roosevelt signed the bill, and approximately 150,000 women served, mostly in clerical and support roles. Now, the women who joined the WWII were not granted military status and did not have the same rank, pay, or benefits. Now, that changed when the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was renamed the Women's Army Corps in 1943. They were granted military status. A number of African American women also served in the Women's Army Corps, and there was a small number of Japanese American women, Nisei from the second generation, served in the Women's Army Corps as well. And here's one woman, Corporal Mary Lou Payton, Women's Army Corps Squadron D, 3030th Army Air Force, served at Fort Oglethorpe, Mather Field, and Roswell Air Base. African-American Sergeant Alice Eva Mae Phillips served at Fort Des Moines, Amarillo, and Lockbourne Base in Ohio. Women also assisted and served with the Army Air Force. Probably the most well-known are the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And they ferried military planes in the United States and Canada. They were really a smaller number, probably a little over 1,000. Now, unlike their counterparts in the WWII, they were not granted military status. You do see the airwacs being established in 1943, and about 40,000 women served in the airwacs, which is women in the Air Force. About 50% served in clerical and support positions, but some became aerial photographers, radio operators, flight clerks, and aircraft mechanics. In July of 1942, President Roosevelt signed a bill that created the Navy's Women's Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, known as the WAVES, as well as the United States Marine Corps Reserve female branch. In the WAVES, about 100,000 women served, and they were granted military status, and they were eligible for veterans benefits, as was their counterparts in the United States Marine Corps Reserve female. About 23,000 women served in the Marine Corps Reserve. In November of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed a bill that created the SPAR, which was the Women's Reserve of the Coast Guard. And about 10,000 women joined, including Shirley Robb, Seaman Second Class, who served in Florida and New York. Women had traditionally served as nurses in the military, and you have the Army Nurse Corps and the Army or the Navy Nurse Corps. The Army Nurse Corps was actually established in 1901, and the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. During the Second World War, approximately 60,000 women served in the ANC, and 14,000 served in the NNC. And you have about 500,000, or not 500,000, 500 African-American women served in the ANC. Most were assigned to duty stations to treat African-American men and prisoners of war. The NNC did not accept African-American nurses until January of 1945. Another important source for those serving in the military after December 7th, included African American men. The number of African American men who served in the United States military was about 1,056,841. And if you were to break that out, over 885,000 served in the Army, 153,000, over 153,000 served in the Navy, over 16,000 in the Marine Corps, and a little over 1,600 in the Coast Guard. Now, like their female counterparts, this military, as you know, was segregated. And so they served, and they had to serve in different camps, segregated camps, bases, mess halls, recreational facilities. And in many ways, the War Department was very slow to, even though they opened, even though the draft was certainly open to African American men, they were slow to deploy them in the various theaters. So the goal was to have the military be comprised of at least 10% of African Americans, because that was essentially the 10% of the population of the United States was African American. So you can see here, certainly in the Army, you have the 92nd and the 93rd Division. This is A. William Perry on the left-hand side of the screen. And on the right-hand side, you can see his newsletter from the 92nd Division. We're probably familiar with African Americans who served in the Air Force, the Tuskegee Airmen, and you can see their photographs there on both sides of the screen. African Americans who served in the Navy trained at Camp Robert Smalls, Great Lakes, Illinois, and African American men who served in the Marines trained at Montford Point, North Carolina. Hispanic and Latino members made up an important component of those who served in the Second World War. One source noted that over 51,000 Puerto Ricans served. Another source noted that 350,000 Mexican Americans served. Unlike African Americans who served in segregated units, Hispanic and Latino members of the military did not. And so it makes it difficult to kind of provide an accurate accounting of the actual numbers who served. Other important members of the United States military who served included 33,000 Japanese Americans, 20,000 indigenous peoples, over 13,000 Chinese Americans, over 11,500 Filipino Americans, and 1,320 Native Hawaiians. Now, with regards to sexual orientation, the armed services, beginning with World War II, attempted to prohibit homosexuals from serving through a general psychiatric screening exam that was given when they enlisted. However, as historian Alan Berube has demonstrated, they served. According to his estimates, at least 650,000 and perhaps as many as 1.6 million male soldiers were homosexual. Berube argued that these, quote, new screening directives and procedures, however, though ineffective in excluding the vast majority of gay men, introduced to the military the idea that homosexuals were unfit to serve in the armed forces because they were mentally ill, end quote. Berube continued, quote, the psychiatrists wrote this idea into military regulations and directives. The belief that gay men and lesbians constituted a class of people who must be excluded from the armed forces became an important part of military policy, end quote. In 1944, the War Department issued Circular Number 3 that outlined a procedure on what to do with suspected homosexuals. Instead of being in prison for their homosexual acts, the directive required their discharge from service. And one researcher estimated that at least 50,000 gay and lesbian members were discharged for their sexual orientation each year throughout the war. So this photograph that you see here is the Japanese American service members from the 442nd Combat Team. They trained at Camp Shelby. Here they're attending a dance joined by some Japanese American women from a relocation camp. So the 442nd went on to be one of the most decorated units in all of World War II. So the significance of those who served, when I think about World War II and the loss of life, it's an extraordinary numbers and figures. It's been estimated that between 50 and 60 million people died in World War II worldwide. And that's a figure that I always have a hard time getting my mind around, including 6 million people who perished in the Holocaust. The 16 million men and women who served from roughly 1940 until 1945 definitely played an important effort, crucial effort, in bringing this World War to a close. And that is a significant achievement that should not go unrecognized. When you look at this in terms of the numbers of American military personnel who died, it's 400,000. And an additional 670,000 members of the United States military were wounded in action. Even though they brought an end to some of the fascist totalitarian rulers, many of these individuals faced significant challenges in pursuing their own civil and human rights when they returned home to the United States. And most all of these groups became stronger advocates for pressing for their civil rights and human rights in the post-World War II period. African Americans did this, Japanese Americans who were interned and who served, Native Americans, Hispanic and Latino Americans, all pushed for greater recognition of their civil and human rights at the conclusion of the Second World War and into the post-World War II period. So one of the important elements when looking at this is, what happens in this post-World War II period. When Harry Truman becomes president in 1945, he put the issue of civil rights on the table in the post-World War II period. And he created a committee in December of 1946 to look at the status of civil rights in the United States. And it was the President's Committee on Civil Rights. They released a report in 1947 that gave their report. And this committee was ethnically, religiously diverse, included individuals of color and women. And this was a real damning indictment of the civil rights and specifically how the federal government had not secured the rights of all of its citizens. And if you haven't not been aware of this document to secure these rights, it's definitely one you need to take a look at. It looks at the challenges that African Americans faced. It looks at the challenges of most all of these groups who their rights had not been secured, even after fighting through the Second World War. And so what the President's Committee on Civil Rights and what to secure these rights essentially argues is that the federal government needed to take on a greater role in securing the rights of all of its citizens. So that was something that Truman definitely, within the context of the Cold War, knew that if the United States was going to try to set an example, it had to somehow come to terms with the fact that it did not treat all of its citizens equally. And that is something that in the Cold War, the Soviet Union would certainly use against the United States. If the United States tried to talk about civil rights or human rights violations in the Soviet Union turns that argument on its head and says, look, look at how you've treated African Americans. And Truman was moved by specific cases of individuals. One African American sergeant, his name was Isaac Woodard, came back at the conclusion of the Second World War, having served, and he was on a bus in the South, pulled off the bus and had his eyes essentially gouged out. African American leaders made Harry Truman, aware of this, and this is one of the incidents that probably factored in Harry Truman's decision to create this committee. In addition, there were other points of racial violence in the post-World War II period. And so Truman engages with this. Truman finally delivers on one key issue that certainly was important to African Americans, but many others, is that he issues the Executive Order 9981, which requires the United States military to integrate. And this was the one issue that President Franklin Roosevelt could not deliver. And Harry Truman does issue that executive order, again, within the context of the Cold War, but again, within the context of African Americans specifically pushing this issue to the forefront in the immediate post-World War II period. Here are these two documents here: to secure these rights and freedom to serve. Freedom to serve was essentially the document that there was a committee as well, the Fahey Committee, that was tasked with overseeing how the various branches would implement the Executive Order 9981. And that explains, freedom to serve explains how those military branches were going to integrate their military forces. Some other significant impacts in the immediate post-World War II period: the Women's Service Integration Act of 1948. And this particular law created 9 categories of service: the Army Nurse Corps, Navy Nurse Corps, the Air Force Nurses Corps, Army Medical Specialist Corps, Women's Army Corps, Women's Air Force, Women's Naval Reserves, and the Women Marines. And the law officially made women an important part of the nation's military. One other important component, definitely related to World War II, was the impact of the GI Bill. Now, it was passed in 1944, but its true impact was actually implemented in the post-World War II period. And under the bill, provided counseling, disability, unemployment compensation, a 4-year college education, low-interest loans to finance homes, farms, and businesses for those that had served. While the bill privileged white male veterans, it did not preclude veterans of color and women from participating. Approximately 7.8 million World War II veterans pursued education or training using the GI Bill, and at least 2.2 million did so at the college level. 5.4 million veterans utilized the unemployment compensation, and 3.8 million participated in the low-interest loan programs to purchase homes and participate in a booming post-World War II consumer culture. Now, for other Americans, many of these issues in terms of inclusion continued well past the immediate post-World War II period, and that included the role of women in the United States military, as well as the role of LGBTQ plus Americans. And those challenges in many ways are still ongoing. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Um, and again, please remember you can pop your questions into the chat window in Zoom. You can also use the raise hand feature if you would like to ask a question live. And while we wait for some questions to come in, I was wondering, as someone who has studied this period in time for quite a while and was recently tasked with writing a very, very short essay on this and giving us a really short presentation. In doing the research for the essay and for this presentation, is there anything in looking at it in this kind of new context that really surprised you, or that you wish you could have worked into any of the particular essays you wrote, but just didn't have the word count that perhaps folks would find interesting?
I mean, you can do essays really on any number of, I would like to see more inclusion, particularly of Hispanic or Latino Americans who served. It's certainly there. But it's a little bit more difficult. As I said, they didn't necessarily serve in segregated units. And so their stories are certainly important. But when I go to the resources to try to find them, it's not as prevalent as I would like to see. More and more of the content is being put online. For most of these, in terms of my sources, I was using the Library of Congress photographs. Library of Congress has extensive oral histories with veterans, and you can also find your state historical societies usually have veterans oral history programs. It's a matter of trying to kind of, there's not a one-stop shop, and I think that makes it a little bit more challenging. And even the numbers, I mean, which I think are important to kind of give you an overview, sometimes those are not easy to find. The World War II museum does have some excellent kind of resources on some of the chronologies on some specific groups. But I think the World War II experience is really one that is still at home, is still kind of under discussed. And I think there's a lot more that we definitely have to say. But in terms of just trying to give people kind of the nuts and bolts, I mean, you can get really, really specific, and then each one of these topics, like I said, you could take a deep dive and write a 2,500 word essay on, which so it's
Yeah, and that's a great plug for one of the other very difficult writing projects that we're collaborating with the Park Service on, which is both an update to the original World War II Homefront theme study done for the Park Service in 2006, I believe. And along with that, that research team is having to write state and territory histories, which will give us a whole new wealth of information, looking at a lot of these pieces of the story and population that you just highlighted need some additional work. So yeah, another group struggling with word counts. We have several questions in the chat now. I will start with two from TJ Banholzer. Their first question is it correct that the peacetime draft was in anticipation of the war? And if no, impending war was on the horizon, this draft would not have occurred in 1940.
Well, I will answer it, I think, this way. In terms of when you look at the fall of France, which was June of 1940, that was very instrumental in terms of pushing appropriations for military defense, and pretty instrumental in getting ready for this first peacetime draft. And that's how I kind of look at that scenario. But I think they knew, they meaning the president, members of Congress, they knew that it was probably a matter of time. And, the national emergency began in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. And the national emergency actually doesn't end until 1952. And that's when the Truman actually signs an end to the national emergency. Now, that was not because of Korea necessarily. That was its own entity at that point. But yeah, so this putting the country on kind of a war footing began really early on, it seemed to me. And I think it's one of the reasons why, when we look at just the context and try to understand why are things happening at a particular time, it's not December 7th, 1941. It's 1940, where you see the peacetime draft, but you see the camps explode, which I'll talk more about the camps on Friday of this week. But I mean, it's just a tremendous explosion in construction and moving people around. And I think that's a part of the story that we don't really capture. We get boots on the ground in a theater, but I don't think you come away with, there's a similar kind of motion in the United States. I mean, the situation of the camps, the draft, people constantly moving, and that is a part of the story which I don't think we feel. It's easy to see a military operation, but there was a lot of kind of equivalent to that going on within the United States. And I'm just struck by the fact, 1 in 10 Americans served in the military, during 41 to 45. So, I mean, that's a significant number.
Thank you. The next question is, at the point the branches other than the Army began to acquire draftees, was the rules around non-discrimination loosened, or did they just finally come to accept the rules because the need for men and women was too significant due to the war?
So, I mean, you still have a segregated military. I mean, up through, the Second World War, they do, in different theaters, there's different kind of interactions that do take place among some of the segregated units and those that are not. But I mean, it was still, it's amazing to look at the back and forth that Franklin Roosevelt had with the NAACP and others who were pushing to have an integrated military. And that is an issue that Harry Truman inherits. But he inherits that within the context of a different war, the Cold War, which, in my comments, in some ways the question, why does Harry Truman decide to integrate the military? Why does he do it? Is it he becomes aware of the discrimination? Yes. But the United States is playing a different role in the world post World War II, and where it has to set an example with its civil and human rights. And these areas of flashpoints of violence that Truman hears about and that civil rights leaders remind him about, force his hand in some ways. So I think I might have gotten away from answering the question, but it's a different context. And that is an important calculus when trying to understand the integration of the military. The Cold War is an important calculus.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Ohio. Could you touch again on what was the experience of the service members that caused them to come back to the United States ready to advocate for civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights? I missed your comment and wanted to make sure I understood the causation.
Well, I mean, in terms of particularly for the African American experience, where they go into the military, they experience, segregated training. Most of the training camps that they were dispatched to were in the South. So, getting off of the outside of the camp, they were subjected to all kinds of discrimination, and they really wanted that to stop. And so, particularly for African Americans, their motivation was their continued experience with discrimination. We shed our blood, we shed our sweat, and it should be honored in terms of our work. We should not have to advocate for civil rights and human rights. We've done our part, the double victory. And so, for other folks in terms of their service, one of the first steps for women, it was to have their service actually recognized as military service, so that they could be granted benefits. And that was an issue, and that was solved early on. But then, as we know, in terms of just the role of women in the military, that has been, continues to be discussed in the immediate post-World War II period and beyond. In terms of LGBTQ plus individuals, you go right into the Cold War, and then you have the Lavender Scare, which really was very prescriptive in terms of homosexuals or individuals engaged in deviant acts were seen as some sort of security risk. And so you see this trend, which Berube talks about just from the Second World War, where homosexuality and lesbian behavior is treated as, some kind of disorder. It really begins to be codified in the Cold War era, and where you are seen as a security risk. And that applied not just to the military, but to folks working for the federal government. But it does encourage folks to continue to push for their civil and human rights, which are not being recognized. So.
Thank you. And tying to that, we have a question from Kathleen Madigan. What caused the military to shift women from auxiliary to full military status from WAAC to WAC?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, there were definitely, they wanted to be recognized for their service. And there were definitely some within the ranks who, to not be recognized as their counterparts, that was not acceptable. And they were doing military service for their country. And so that definitely encouraged those women to be more advocates, so that they would be recognized for their service. So yes, so there's a lot of just challenges in terms of being recognized for what you're doing. And I think, at a human level, I think we I hope we kind of understand that. I mean, regardless of race, class, gender, sexuality, that, these individuals they're serving, and to be denied something based on a category is not acceptable. And so I think throughout history, you'll find folks that are going to, push for that recognition, as they should, in a way that constantly is a reminder that, look, we've served. We should not have to put up with this kind of treatment. So that's a very powerful thing, and not easily captured. Yeah, I think a lot of those were, I don't know, I can't remember if I said this or not, but in terms of what's really striking, one of the things that really strikes me, particularly about the African American experience, and pushing for civil and human rights, is that during the war, the actual membership of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, increased. And one of the main reasons for that had to do with the fact of how they're getting reports from their family members. This is the kind of discrimination we're facing in these camps, in our training. And so they wanted to be heard in the post-World War II period, that this is not enough, or this is enough. I mean, we can't take this kind of treatment anymore. You see this among some of the Tuskegee Airmen. Todd Moy's written a book that talks about kind of their activism as others. I mean, you'll find folks who are being active across the spectrum.
And we have another question here. Oh, no. While we wait, we have time for probably another question or two. And while folks consider what those might be, I did want to remind everyone that we have 3 more webinars in this series. Coming up this week on Thursday, also at 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll be joined by Dr. Kurt Peeler to talk about Criteria 6, Civil Defense Preparedness. Then on Friday, also at 1 o'clock Eastern, we'll be joined again by Dr. Jon Taylor to talk about the presence of armed forces camps, bases, airfields, harbors, repair facilities, and other installations. And then concluding the series, next week on September 27th, also at 1 p.m., we will hear from Erica Fugger on achievements by a city and its environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of the city's contributions to the war effort. So you'll have a few more opportunities to engage with this work, and one more still with Dr. Jon Taylor. So we hope you'll join us for some, if not all of those. And I don't see any other questions that have come into the chat, but Jon, do you have any closing remarks or thoughts? Anything you had in your back pocket?
No, I think just other than the fact that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of, accounting for every individual's experience in the Second World War. And it's just in constant movement, I think. And that, like I said earlier, I don't think we understand just how disruptive the war was. And, where people are moving into defense, or they're moving into military role for the very first time. And so the concept of total war really applies here. I mean, in my lifetime, we've not seen a war like this, where, I mean, you have to know that you're at war. It's not It's not targeted or limited like, the situations with Iraq or Afghanistan. Those are not necessarily total wars, and this is different. And it definitely serves as a catalyst for various groups to press for their rights that they believe that they have been denied. And it's also an opportunity to honor the sacrifices of all Americans here. Again, as defeating these totalitarian governments was significant. And even though there were challenges within the United States. And so, how do you balance those and tell those two aspects and tell a story that is respectful of everybody's experiences is that's a tall order to embrace, but it's one it's complicated. And so it's one of the reasons why I like history, is the complications that it provides us. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. It was a fabulous conversation, and I hope we'll see some of you again on Thursday and Friday this week. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday.
thank you. Bye-bye.